So what do we mean by the Upstander Ripple Effect?
Stand up against hate and prejudice, even if it does not affect you.
From moral dilemmas in today's headlines, upstanders who rose for justice, and stories of survival.
Be prepared to walk away from this conversation inspired and motivated.
Welcome, everybody, to the Upstander Ripple Effect, episode 14. I cannot believe we are at episode 14, themed Upstanders Rise. I'm Jackie Congedo.
And I'm Kevin Aldridge.
And we are so excited to be wrapping up the first season of the Upstander Ripple Effect, and just feeling so much gratitude today for all of the people who've made this possible, the people who've supported this effort from the beginning, the folks behind the scenes who are doing so much of the lifting on the production side, but also everybody who's taken time to be with us along this journey and listen in and share their feedback. So we will be back with another season, but this is the last of the first season. And I want to start by giving a shout out to my amazing co-host, Kevin, for his recent award, which is nothing that surprises me because I know you're the best, but still certainly worth celebrating. The AP Cleveland Press Club First Place Award for Best News Commentary.
Yeah, thanks.
Congratulations to you.
Thanks. I always say, we don't do the work for the awards. We do it because, you believe in the importance of democracy and keeping people informed. But it's always gratifying when, your colleagues and observers of the industry recognize your good work. And so it's humbling, but makes you re-energized to go out every day and continue to fight the good fight for all the readers and viewers out there.
You are fighting the good fight. I think about that every time I read one of your pieces. It's so thoughtful. You're so, we're going to talk a lot actually in this episode about hypocrisy and political hypocrisy, or cognitive dissonance, if you want to say it in a more PC or nicer way. And I just think you embody the spirit of what it means to be able to really reflect critically on your own ideas. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that people need to see modeled more often. So you're teaching all of us that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I try to be honest. One of the hardest things that, we do in life is learning to be honest with ourselves, about ourselves, and what our true intentions are, our motivations, our fears. And that's the part of, the work that you kind of have to do with yourself to where no matter what you do or what direction you go in or what you say, at least you know that it's coming from a genuine place of who you are in that moment, right? And then you just deal with that. And it's just kind of being more real versus being fake.
Authentic.
Yeah,
authenticity.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that comes through in, I think, everything you do. Also, for our friend in the State House.
Yes, Dunny Isaacson, who just this week was named the Ohio House Minority Leader. And so I can't think of a better person for that position than Dunny. I mean, when you think about the work that he did here in Cincinnati with his own company, Cohere, he spent a lot of time gathering perspectives and listening to people and trying to use that information to problem solve, to come up with solutions that work. And I can't think of anyone who's better equipped to try to bring about common ground, consensus, and what has been, I think, a bit of a dysfunctional state house over the last few years. And I'm encouraged by the fact that Dunny is going to be leading things from the Democratic side. I think he's going to do a great job.
Yeah, and he has, I think, a unique way, like you said, of sort of building bridges where they don't exist. And that is the work of government. I mean, that's the work of bipartisanship. And I look forward to sort of what his tenure holds for the state. And congratulations to him. Also just wanted to mention that I just saw Dunny at our Upstander Awards, which we just wrapped up. And every year, I come out of that thinking, wow, I didn't think we could do what we did last year again. And we did it. We really did it. So along with many other elected friends who attended on both sides of the aisle, both parties, we were really had a great evening celebrating Upstanders. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to start with some current events and sort of thinking about, maybe a new perspective, something different. You could listen to any news show and learn about, if you haven't, you might want to check your pulse if you don't know about what we're going to talk about next.
Right.
But if, for the facts and figures, we always try to see how we can unpack things in a way that maybe just takes a deeper look or exposes something that people haven't been thinking about, particularly in the, in light of how, what the history that we teach tells us about how to think about things critically. And so obviously the world has changed substantially since we were last doing one of these. And, we are now in a place where there's a conflict in the Middle East that has, I think, expanded in scope significantly with the involvement of the U.S. in Iran, and sort of, really surprising news that happened on Saturday. And the response to it has been really interesting, and I think has exposed some things that are worth talking about related to how people, stay within or break out of their identity politic, and what kind of pushes people to side in certain ways on certain things and not on other things. And, when is breaking the rules okay, and when is it not? So it's just been interesting. Your colleague Carl Weiser did a interesting piece in the Inquirer about the way this has just changed all kinds of party line alignment that we sort of traditionally see, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, I used to listen to, there was a radio host. His name was Joe Madison. He went by the name of the Black Eagle, and he used to have a saying that says, "There are no permanent friends and enemies, only permanent interests." And so I think you see that at work here as you see people crossing party lines. It's not about necessarily friends or enemies, because I think in this case where you see Greg Landsman, who has been probably one of the staunchest critics of the president, now sort of being on his side as it relates to the bombing of Iran being a good thing, and that is because obviously Greg is very close to being Jewish, is very close to what's been happening in Israel, and there's a personal interest there. There's a vested interest in what's going on there. So he's coming at it from a particular angle of where his interest crosses over whatever other issues that he might have had politically with the president. On this particular issue of interest, they're able to find common ground there. So I think, and then vice versa on the other side, you've seen some people who are normally in the president's corner who are sort of breaking ranks on the GOP side to be somewhat critical of his decisions there, and whether or not they're constitutional and what for. So it's very interesting just to see how this sort of thing sort of plays out, and it kind of makes us do a deeper evaluation and a check of ourselves behind sort of where do we really stand on issues, and what is it that we really believe in, and do we really believe in it, or is it situationally things that we believe in, that we believe in it when it's our party or it's our guy, but we don't believe in it when it's the other party and their guy. And so I've always got this saying that I say that the essence of politics is hypocrisy, right? Because that's in essence what it is. It's each party kind of vilifies the other for the same things that they do when they're in power, right? But they don't see it as the same, because they see their cause as righteous. And so anytime we see our cause as righteous, sometimes the rules can be bent for that. Yeah. And then other times they can. I use the example of, if you are someone who has a problem with our immigration system and the southern border, and you say, hey, we're the rule of law and people need to follow the law when they come into this country, they need to come in the right way. If not, they need to go. Well, technically, that kind of is the rule of law for our country. But then there are people on the other side who say, we ought to have compassion and, yeah, people should come in the right way, but they're fleeing injustice and things of that nature. Or they're already here, so we should flex the rules to show compassion because we see that as a righteous cause to welcome these people into America. So, but when we say, hey, bending the rules to keep a nuclear weapon out of the hand of an enemy that has said that death to America and Israel, maybe the ends justify the means of bending the rules a little bit by not following, going to Congress first, right? And getting permission that this is a righteous thing to keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of an enemy that would see us destroyed. And then there are people, some of those same people who want to bend the rules for immigration and say,
shouldn't be bending them there.
Yeah, shouldn't be bending them there. So where do the rules apply, and when is it okay to break the rules, and is that in the eye of the beholder?
Yeah, and I mean, I think so. One thing I just want to go back to related to Greg, because I think it's important that yes, Greg is Jewish. Yes, Greg is, supportive, obviously, of Israel's right to defend itself and to exist as a sovereign country. Mm-hmm. And what I've heard from Greg is sort of what you just shared, which is, of course, those things are considerations and they're inherently part of who I am. But when I'm thinking about my political support for this policy or this military action or whatever it may be, I'm thinking of, I'm taking my role as a U.S. elected official, mm-hmm. congressional elected official seriously to say, how can I best represent the first district of Ohio mm-hmm. in this perspective and what's good for us. And I think he has said, and I know he feels strongly this way, it's in Carl's piece, that this is an attempt to end this chaos, bring about peace, and to avoid what would be a catastrophic event. So, we can debate all day what was on the ground in Iran and, what's the evidence we have of that. And, but I think there has been, from Greg's perspective, it's not just about Jewishness. It's not just about Israel. It's about threats to the U.S. It's about Iran's position in sort of the global context as potentially a nuclear power at some point or close to, and the threat that poses to sort of global security. So it's just an important distinction that it's yes, he has maybe a special interest in mm-hmm. thinking more carefully about some of these things because of his awareness and identity. But I think his positioning on this has more to do with his feelings about what the implications of a nuclear Iran for the United States and for sort of global security. But I also want to pick up on where you left off, which is this idea of breaking the rules. And it's interesting when you think about the history, some of the perpetrators during, as they were on trial in the aftermath of the war, their defense, what they tried to say in defense of themselves was, well, those were the laws. We were following the laws, right?
Yeah.
This was legalized exclusion, right? I mean, you could say the same about our own history in this country, right?
Yeah.
So, the law is important and process and policy is really important, but it doesn't always dictate morality. And how we navigate that is really a challenge, right? Like in search of a more perfect union in our context. But in the context of the history, that's a pretty bad excuse, right? That I participated in this because it was what the law told me to do, and it was so contrary to what we all know from a human standpoint, from a value standpoint, is the right thing, right? The mass killing of millions of innocent people is unjustifiable. So, it's interesting to think about, because you want to say, well, the solution to that is let's all agree to a set of laws and let's follow those and let's never. But sometimes laws aren't aren't
We
right.
don't. Yeah, we don't always agree on the laws, right? I mean, that's part of this democracy that we live in. And again, even King himself said that you're not obligated to follow any laws that are unjust. Wherever there are unjust laws or injustice, you're not under any kind of moral obligations to follow those laws. And so then that's where you sort of get into this murky area about
What do you, well,
people's
then what?
yeah,
Right.
people's values and moralities are not all the same as much as we like to think that they are. I remember, Barack Obama and various politicians have said this where they talk about American values, right? Do any of us know what that like really means anymore? I think there's kind of like a vague generality about what we think American values ought to be.
The
But when
ethos of what it is to be American.
yeah,
Yeah.
but when we see some of the actions and the things that we're taking and some of the laws that are being passed, I think one would reasonably question depending on where you are, like what is America's values these days. I mean, I think that's one of the overarching questions I think that we're all wrestling with, and it's one of the things that many folks are challenged by with this administration, because you feel like that there are things that are being done that are not representative of what American values are. But those things are being couched under the guise of
As
American
American
values,
values.
right? So
Yeah.
it's like, so that's the tension of where we are in this moment.
Yeah, and part of that I think just has to do with like shared. We've talked a lot about this, the shared set of facts or lack thereof. How can we all have a common narrative and a common sort of expression of values when we're not drinking from the same information source, or we don't have a shared understanding for what's real and what's not? So interestingly, our amazing producer Ann Thompson found a piece about this sort of, we want to put hypocrisy nicely. We would say cognitive dissonance, right?
More scientifically,
That's
right?
the like academic way, non-judgmental way to say you're a hypocrite is you have some cognitive dissonance issues. Um, and so she found this a really interesting piece out of it's on Neurolaunch actually. It's out of the space of sort of political psychology around the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. And I think it cites a couple of really helpful strategies for breaking free from the mental maze, strategies for reducing cognitive dissonance in politics. And so I just think these are worth looking at. A lot of them hit on some of the same themes that as I'm bumping the microphone, that we talked about. We've talked about all along over the course of the season. First, how do we encourage more critical thinking and self-reflection? Start by asking yourself some tough questions. Why do you believe what you believe? So instead of being so entrenched in what you always thought you knew, maybe just be a little bit more curious about your own assumptions and ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about being honest with yourself and doing your honest assessment of why you are where you are in the moment and why are you feeling the way that you feel. I mean, I think for many people, when just using the Iran situation as an example, I think if you're one of those people who are in favor of the bombing, and I think we all sort of agree that a nuclear Iran is a bad thing. But what really propels people, I think, in this moment is the sense of urgency, the threat, the fear maybe that's associated with that. And we know that when we have moments of fear, particularly when there's past trauma related to that, that doesn't always produce in us the most clear-eyed and clear-headed thinking in situations, because we're acting in a very primal part of ourselves that says safety first, defend ourselves first. Sometimes no matter what that takes, or at whatever cost that is. And it can lead us to sometimes making bad decisions or even going too far. So I think we've got to ask ourselves, like, what are we feeling in these moments and what is going through us that's causing us to say, either I agree or disagree with this in this moment, and why do I feel so strongly?
Yeah,
about it?
and that leads into this sort of second tip about promoting exposure to diverse political viewpoints, which you know a thing or two about. Clearly, the Cleveland press agrees with you. agrees with me that you know a thing or two about that because they've recognized you as someone who does a good job with this, which is serving up, a full buffet of thoughts and opinions and justifications for those thoughts and opinions. I think it's really important that people, as we've talked about, confront those things. And I love that this says it might feel like entering enemy territory, but you might be surprised at what you learn and you might make a friend or two.
Absolutely.
I mean, it seems like a little, I get Pollyannish in this moment, might feel that way, but I actually think that if we get more curious, not just about our own assumptions, but about other people's perspectives and ideas, and political viewpoints, what are we so afraid of? Are we afraid of being wrong? Are we afraid of learning something that we didn't consider,
Yeah, I think yes. And then I also think there's like we're sort of in this moment, and I've heard people say this, that if somebody, particularly now, disagrees with you politically, that you can't be friends with them. Like you can't have a conversation with somebody who sees things different. And people have bought into this notion that, if you're liberal versus conservative, then whichever side you're on, the opposite side is evil. And you can't have a conversation. Like there's not saying that's the case with everybody, but in far too many cases, that's the case. And we sort of have bunkered in this moment that now says, I can't agree or concede anything to the other side because that will normalize it, right? I heard a lot of this with people who maybe even if you agree with the strike, but you don't want to give Donald Trump any credit.
Yep.
You can't say,
right.
Oh, it was a good strike or this, that, or the other, because I don't want to normalize Trump in any way because there's a whole lot of other things that I don't agree with.
Yeah, yep.
And
I
so
think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, and so I think it's hard to do the second point when you take that attitude of saying I can't fraternize with the enemy in any way, and there's no merit to anything that they have to say, nor will I believe it because I don't think they're operating from
they're not
the same set
honest
of facts.
brokers.
Yeah.
They're not. Yeah.
And
There's
so
a
it's very
credibility
hard
issue.
for people to be willing to sort of cross that line. But you got to ask yourself, how do you ever bring those people into the knowledge of anything different if you're not willing to engage in those? And they're tough. I mean, look, these are going to be hard, frustrating conversations.
Yep.
And I get
not something to do like on an empty stomach when
Yeah.
you've been up all night.
Right. And I get
fill up your
everybody's
tank and then take a crack at it.
And I get everybody's not built to do that. I'm not suggesting that when you're in the height of your emotions that you try to have these conversations. Pick your spots and pick your places where you are in a space to be able to receive and have that conversation. Probably the best time is not right when something happens and you're super fired up about it. That's probably not the best time to have that conversation. Sit with it with yourself for a while. And then figure out how do you engage somebody else and be willing to you said it. One of the things that we're not willing to do enough is to be willing to admit to ourselves that there's a good chance that we're wrong, that there's information we don't have, and be willing to accept information that's correct, but it runs counter to our narrative. Like right now they're having this conversation about how much damage did the strikes actually do, right? And there are some reports that are out there that are saying, well, it didn't do as much damage as the Trump administration says. And, of course, the president comes out and he says, that's garbage. They got it wrong. Now, we don't know like right now because there's a lot of information out there. But let's just say for the sake of argument, those reports are correct. You got to be able to move to a place where you say, just because accurate information that doesn't back up my narrative, that's not a reason for me to reject it. And
inconvenient truths.
Yeah, absolutely. We got to be willing to accept inconvenient truths when we're confronted with it and say, you know what, I was wrong about it. I had bad information. It's okay to be wrong. The reality is most of us are way wrong. We're wrong way more than we're right.
And it would be great if we had a political culture that incentivized that rewarded that, that didn't, at the very least, didn't penalize that. I feel like we're in a place in our politics where it's like, well, you shouldn't waver. I mean, we're seeing that in the critique right now of people, like Greg, or the critique of just, related to like folks in the MAGA wing talking about, well, this wasn't what he ran on.
Yeah.
And now so it's like just having the ability to, to live in that space where you're open to facts that might run contrary to what you have stood firm on or what you believe. I mean, that's the third piece: embrace fact checking and media literacy. Like, so I see this as like, be critical about your own thoughts. Encourage critical consumption of other people's thoughts and ideas and other viewpoints, and then critical consumption of the actual facts. That's an important part.
Absolutely.
And lastly, this idea of fostering open-mindedness and intellectual humility. Okay to admit, as you said, when you're wrong, that you don't have all the answers. And instead of it being, again, a weakness or treated as a weakness in sort of our body politic, embrace it as a sign of intellectual maturity. When we see somebody who says, you know what, those are new facts. And so as a responsible human being who's, in this case, elected to do a complicated job on behalf of a lot of people with high stakes, I'm going to take that into account, and I might change my position about this.
Absolutely.
And it would be great if we had an electorate that said, good for you.
Because we get stuck on what, and particularly in politics, and it's a gotcha kind of thing, right? It's like, you said this, but here's what you did. And politicians use it because it's the way to get elected. I've got to, in order for me to win, right? Like, politics at its heart is like, in order for me to win, I've got to point to how the other guy failed, right? And so failure is the measure by which we use to turn over our politics, right? So, if a president in his first couple years isn't doing, what we thought he would do, or the results haven't been exactly what we thought, then the House and Senate may change hands, and now you've got different leadership, and then we elect a new president in a couple years after that. So you're right. There is no reward for somebody saying, I thought this, conditions changed, I came into some new information, and we're going to go in this direction now, regardless of what I said before. In any other area, we would admire someone who had the ability to recognize new information and say, and grow, and say, you know what, I might have been wrong about that, right? But in politics,
it's a death sentence.
It's a death sentence. And that's why you get so many of these politicians now, no matter where they are, they will double down, even if they're terribly wrong, and they know it's a mistake. But admitting that you're wrong in politics is political suicide. There is no reward for it. You lose your seat. You lose, you lose the House. You lose the Senate. There is no incentive for backing down.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something you want to talk about. What we can all do. We should try and be part of a culture that actually rewards and incentivizes that, and at the very least doesn't punish people who learn new facts and take that into account and shift and make new assessments. I mean, I think I'm thinking about many different political, actors or elected leaders who along the way have done that. And, on both sides of the aisle, I feel like Hillary was criticized for that. Many have criticized folks like Rob Portman, when he sort of changed his position on gay marriage and gay rights. Because of his own family. Yeah. It's like, well, I have new facts. I have a upfront look at what this is, and I've just decided that I was wrong about that. So I just think it would be something that would be great as a society for us to kind of shift the incentive structure there.
But the key thing there is in this, it talks about intellectual humility, and one has, because if there's nothing that humbles you, it's life experience. Yep. To use the Rob Portman example, right? Yep. Everything sounds good until it lands on your doorstep, and now you have to deal with it. And suddenly these ideologies that you had are very different when you now have to experience this for yourself, or someone close to you does. It changes your perspective. And so many times we speak out of school about things that we haven't experienced and that we have no real frame of reference for. And so what I always try to consider is that no matter how smart I am or how smart I think I am, what I know is vastly outstripped by what I don't know.
Right.
I know there's way more that I don't know than what I do know. And it takes a certain amount of humility to be able to say, I don't know, right? Like and I fight against that because particularly when people expect you to know, right? Like my wife, she thinks I know everything in the world about football, right? And the NFL.
Yeah.
So, and most of the time I know a lot, but I don't know everything. So every now and again, she'll ask me a question that I genuinely don't know.
Once
But
in a
I
blue
have
moon
but I have the expectation
of yourself.
of myself of giving her the answer because I don't want to say to her I don't know because I'm supposed to know everything, right? I'm the football expert. So now she's asked me something that I don't know, and I have to sit there in that moment and say, am I going to make something up? She'll never know, even if I could tell her anything because she doesn't know. She's asking me. So can I make something up just so I don't have to admit that I'm wrong? Or do I say, you know what? I don't know that. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
And so, admittedly, I've gotten better over the years of doing that, of being able to say, you know what? I don't know that. And then she always gives me a hard time. Like, I can't believe you don't know that. I thought you knew it.
She's not creating the kind of social political culture that incentivizes that kind of humility. It makes you all the more resistant probably to admitting that the next time.
Yeah.
So, when we think about hypocrisy, there's been some pieces written recently related to resistance, and some of the hypocrisy baked into how we think about resisting, which I think is also a worthwhile sort of exploration for our conversation about current events. And there's two pieces here I think that kind of lend themselves to this topic. One is by a colleague in the field of Holocaust memory and history, Luke Berryman. The title is "I Study the Resistance Against the Nazis. Here's what the U.S. left can learn from it." So, this is for the sake of sort of thinking about, in this case, we're talking about what this scholar has to say about resistance to the Nazis, and he's positioning that as sort of a, something we can learn. And in this case, he's saying the American left should learn. Mm-hmm. Now, you could argue that, the American right has its own lessons to learn about resistance in other historical contexts or in this historical context. Mm-hmm. So I'm not making a political statement to compare the two, but for the sake of this scholarship and this author, that's his and that's sort of the thesis he's posing. And I think that this piece is so interesting in how it talks about he studied this. Like, he studied resistors in this period of history and sort of pulled out the nuggets of like what was the distinguishing characteristics of resistance during this period. And he talks about how they didn't have a slogan or an outfit or a flag. They didn't even bother to give their group a name. Their first and only concern was a clear path toward justice for at least some of the Nazis' victims. He's talking particularly about a German activist in this case. It's really about this idea that he says it here, sought to improve life for themselves and others in the here and now in any way they could, no matter how small. The resistors I researched, by contrast, he's talking, by contrast to some of the movement on the left today, were laser focused on creating change. Mm-hmm. Not just, trying to say we don't like what is, right?
Yeah,
or sort of bashing what exists, but instead saying, what are we fighting for? What do we want to see different or better? And how do we engage in positive action that brings that about? So I just found this article fascinating to see that there was, there's history, there's research in the history around this, and that not only were these people, turns out, this is a helpful way to think about resistance, but also it was effective.
Yeah.
They were more effective than people who just wanted to stand on the sidelines and throw stones and say, well, not that.
For sure. I mean, and this will, this kind of leads into the Eric Ward's piece that we'll talk about here in a minute, but it's about the work, not the talk, right? So it even goes back to, I think, was it Gandhi who said, be the change that you want to see.
Yep.
And so when you're focused on the work, when you're focused on the change, when you're focused on what you're for instead of just what you're against, you get things done. When you think about people who are the most effective, right? They're not necessarily the loudest people or the people who talk. They're the ones who get down and they do the work. And while everybody else is talking and debating, they're
Or
getting things.
bemoaning.
Yeah, they're getting things done. And so I think that this is what it talks about in terms of the resistance, no matter how small the effort, focus on the work. And again, I think this comes down to leadership because I think
Yeah.
people are reflections of the leadership that they see. And again, going back to our politics is so much on focused about what are you against, right? Like
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
last few elections, it's been maybe not since Barack Obama, right? Have we had an election where the election has been about
What people are voting
someone having a
for.
vision of what you're
Yes.
voting for versus voting against?
Yeah.
I'd say the last three election cycles, going back to 2016, have all been about what we're against, not what we are,
Yeah.
not necessarily what we are for. And we need to figure out some kind of way to get back to that. And it's difficult when all of the voices from the leadership are playing that same tune and folks are on social media, talking and arguing and chattering and going back and forth. What we need is more workers. We need more people who are interested in working for the change and doing less talk, because the talk isn't doing anything other than dividing us further.
Yeah, and particularly negative talk, particularly like what's bad about. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be vigilant or
Right.
we shouldn't call things out or, make sure that we're watching for that. But instead of just speaking out against, what are we speaking for? I just think it's so interesting listening to this author's characterization of effective resistance. He's talking about, what are the hallmarks of resistance that's grounded in that are effective, that were effective during that time. And he says, by contrast, I was always struck by the sense of shared humanity among the resistors that I discovered, like the lower level British intelligence officials who persuaded members of the German public to help them smoke out Nazi war criminals after 1945, or Leon Bass, the black American soldier who drew on his own experiences of segregation to deepen his understanding of the suffering of the Jewish people he liberated from Buchenwald. So this idea, I think, of shared humanity, centering shared humanity is one key defining characteristic of what really actually is not just, I think, morally righteous resistance, but grounded, effective resistance.
Absolutely.
And then the other one is, whatever the case, when their moment of realization comes, we must be ready to embrace them. He's talking about, the degradation too often that happens on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah. Well,
about
you talked about shared humanity, right? I think the thing that we've got to recognize in this country is first of all, is that we're all Americans, right? That we all should be playing for the same team, right? There this notion of, two different Americas, right? Like and Civil War and all this stuff. We got to put that on the deck and recognize that we're all Americans, that we have a shared humanity. And part of that is not participating in the dehumanization of the other side. It's hard, it's hard to bring somebody back into fellowship and allyship that basically you've raked over the coals. I mean, if anybody thought about it personally, if you had somebody who just talked about you like an absolute dog, right? It's hard for you to come to the table with that person at some point and say, let's work together, let's be friends. So I think if our goal is to try to be a more perfect union and heal this country, we're not going to get there by degrading,
The other side.
the
Yeah.
other side to the
Right.
point where we can't possibly come back together because the feelings are too hard.
Yeah.
And I think that we've got to keep that in the front of the mind and learn how to respect each other's experiences and points of view, even if we disagree, to the point of where at some point we got to be able to we've got to be able to come back together as a country.
Yeah. Yeah. He says, if there's one thing I learned while writing this book about effective resistance, in the 1930s and 40s, it's that effective resistance to the far right or in any case to anything that you resist, right? If you're on the right, you're resisting the left, or the far left, is never just about defeating the enemy. It's about creating a better future for everyone.
Yes.
And that locks into what you're saying. We are one nation. So unless we just plan on changing that, we have to figure out how to, do this in a way that gets us there together. How does that happen? And
well, it happens with creative thinking. Speaking of people who are smart and far smarter than me, I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson the other day. I was watching a video with him, and I mean, this guy just makes me feel like a first grade student every time I hear him talk. But he essentially talked about, like, part of our problem is we don't think creatively enough about how to create new things. Like, part of what we're seeing now is culturally and how things are changing, and we're trying to take a changing cultural environment and continue to fit it into the same old
box it's always been in.
boxes that we've always had, instead of thinking like, just using the transgender sports thing as an issue. He said, why aren't we thinking about new ways to engage in sports versus, instead of just thinking like, the old boxes that we always
men's
have
sports,
about
women's sports. Yeah, right.
Yeah, he talked about it, like, even in boxing, they have different weight classes because, somebody who's 250 pounds is not going to fight somebody who's like 145.
Yeah.
It's like we're capable of coming up with new ways of doing things, but we're sort of locked in this mentality, and it goes back to the kind of make America great again philosophy. Not just picking on that, but that is a philosophy that's endemic of an idea that there was this once perfect way of doing things, and that's the only way of doing things, and we got to get back to that, instead of recognizing that we are different. We're a different country, and we're going to be a different country in 20 years than we are today. And if we still keep trying to do things back in the way we did in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, that's just not good, because people are different. Times are different. And we've got to be able to think creatively about how do we move forward and, again, create something that works for everybody.
Yeah. So this piece also mentions, just to give a shameless plug for some of our work, what's giving him hope, right? This is a guy, again, who studies resistance. What's giving him hope? He says, teachers and librarians are championing the written word as a tool of resistance. Colleagues in the field of Holocaust education are collaborating on free and innovative events to inform the public about the collapse of democracy in the 20th century, early 20th century Europe, and to establish what we can learn from it today. So we actually just hosted our first one of these, sort of exploring, let's actually talk about what it did look like. We don't have to hyperbolize. Like,
right.
Let's talk to scholars who have studied and researched this history. What did the Nazi rise to power? What were the hallmarks of the Nazi rise to power? And what were they not, right? Let's not overreach. Let's just take a critical examination of the facts of history and understand them for what they were. Yep. So we're working on that series now. We have more information about that in the show notes. And I think this whole idea of, how do we build? How do we not just tear down, but how do we build? How do we think about effective resistance that's not grounded in cognitive dissonance or hypocrisy, but that's grounded in shared humanity, that's grounded in thinking about what does good look like, not just what is not bad. I say that all the time, but that's how we think about, in the museum, right? We have the Holocaust Gallery, which talks about what does it look like when the worst of humanity has prevails or has a way to takes hold, despite, of course, the many upstanders who were doing the right thing. But we didn't build a humanity gallery, and we're, by the way, not working on a new humanity gallery that's going to say, here's what it looks like to go against. What we're doing in the humanity space is saying, here's tools for how to be the best. And to your point about what doesn't exist, we have to envision that. We have to say, like, oh, okay, well, it's not enough just to not be that thing. The question is, what can we be?
Yeah.
What does good look like? And how do we use these, in our case, character strengths as a toolkit to unpack our own potential in that way?
One of the things that made America great and the country that it is is we used to aspire to big things, right? Like we dreamed big, we thought big, we came up with big things. Now I think we think too small. I think we've become small minded in many ways, and I think that's a symptom of what you talk about it. It's more of how do we not be this versus what do we aspire to
Right.
be.
Right.
What is the best version of ourself,
The potential.
look
What's the
like?
potential? Yeah.
And we can't shrink from the size of that, because I think what sometimes happens is we get discouraged because big dreams can seem overwhelming or unattainable. And no, you're not going to get there overnight. None of the great accomplishments that we've ever had happened overnight, but it was sustained work toward it.
Yeah.
Right. And you take the small victories, you celebrate the small successes, but you keep chopping wood,
Well, and fear and scarcity are the enemy of creativity.
Right.
Like you can't operate out of a creative space mentally, like in terms of, the physiology of the brain. Like if you're stuck living in a place of like fight or flight, you're not thinking in an expansive way. There's no potential, sort of dreaming potential work happening there. So I think being more interested in what we are building than what we are tearing down is an interesting way to think about this. Our friend and visionary, talk about somebody who makes me feel like a first grader every time I read what he writes. Eric Ward just wrote a piece for News One. You don't get to burn it down if you've never built a damn thing.
Yeah.
And I'm just using that because those are his words.
Yeah.
And he says, it's a beautiful piece. It's so powerful. And I guarantee you, it doesn't matter who you are or what side of anything you're on, it will challenge you.
Absolutely.
It says, so at the very end, he says, if you came here looking for a manifesto, this is it. We will not escape the fire just to fan its flames elsewhere. We will not carry the master's tools and call them liberation. We will not build new systems that mirror the violence we claim to oppose. I mean, if that's not a mic drop, and that challenges everybody, right? He says, we need warriors of repair. And then he finishes with, I'm not asking permission. I'm calling for courage. I'm invoking grief as resistance. I'm part of building something that doesn't yet have a name, but you'll know it when you see it. It will look like life.
Yeah.
It's not about killing in the name of killing. It's not about violence in the name of violence. It's not an eye for an eye. It's about what does good look like and how do we build that? How do we build towards that?
I mean, I'm a fan of Eric. I'm probably,
And we're like the
I don't know,
co-chairs of the Eric Ward fan
groupie,
club.
is that a derogative term? I
No,
mean,
100%.
I would, you could characterize me as that when it comes to Eric. It's because he has such knowledge and such a heart and such a perspective, and then he has the ability to be able to weave that into words that don't just hit you mentally, they hit you emotionally as well, and really, really challenge you. And I would encourage
so
people
well
to go
said.
find this piece. It's great. I wish we'd published this in the Inquirer.
Right?
To
It's
be
really
honest
good.
with you, yeah, it's really, really, really good. But
There's still time to call him probably and ask if you could.
Yeah. I mean,
It's a great piece.
I mean, he raises a good point about, and I think the ending that he had was very good there when he talked about life, right? Like that is the choice that we face every day. We can give life or we can take life. Like that's the reality of every single day, every choice that we make. And this is a very like a spiritual concept for me when I think about this, is that are we life givers or are we life takers? And I try to live my life, not perfectly, but every day thinking about how do I give life versus taking away. Even in my criticism, how do I give life? How can I be critical of somebody without taking their life, leaving them something that says, appealing to the best part of yourself, even in the criticism. And I think, Eric does a great job of reminding us of that. And his challenge, I think about sort of what we hear about, peace through strength, or we'll get peace through war. Like it's almost like these are notions that run counter to each other. It's like, peace is life. War is death. So how do you get life from death is sort of the question that we have to ask ourselves, which is why a lot of people who, whether it's Martin Luther King or Gandhi or people who were, against this notion of war, consistently against this notion of war, it's because they understood that, you don't get life from killing. And that is something that we have to reconcile is how do we, when we all have these differing agendas, these different challenges that we have, how do we create life and avoid the choices that lead, to burning things down?
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah. And I would say that, no one's naive over here, right? There's a pragmatism to all this, and there are real threats, and all of that is true. And I love his, thinking about we need warriors of repair. It's like the oxymoron of that is really powerful, but it's so true. Like if we're going to be fierce about something, let's be fierce in a way that centers our shared humanity. Let's be fierce in a way that is sort of like radically inclusive. And grounded in that. And I think, we got a chance to celebrate that. We got a chance to celebrate that on Sunday. Well, by the time you're listening, it's probably not last Sunday, but it's maybe a few Sundays ago, this month in June, with our Upstander Awards, celebrating just an outstanding slate of amazing everyday people. These are not like the folks who get the accolades. These are people who are just, something moved them. They found their moment. They harnessed their character strengths, and they said, as we've talked about, there's something that I can do about this, and I see a better future for this, and I'm going to activate to get that done. And so, it was amazing. And of course, we named the awards after our survivors and other Upstanders, and we have their family members come and help present the awards. It is the most high vibes, recharging event. And I'm not just saying that because I'm obviously a little biased. I have heard that
with good reason.
Thank you. I appreciate that. From every corner of all of our constituents, that, this is like a total recharge in a moment that continues to be a challenge. So, it was great. And just to see also like some of the Upstander Award winners from last year coming back, and not just coming back, but wanting to reconnect with the families that the awards they got were named after. Like, is so-and-so going to be here? I want to take a picture. And then sharing that stuff. Some of the things that people have said about what this has meant to them, and folks who've won the awards, is really will bring tears to your eyes. It was so moving.
You know what's great about, and this has just been a great transition, how all of this is run together. You know what's great about the Upstander Awards, and I get this a lot too, being in the news industry, is that the people you're honoring are the people that we talk about who've kept their heads down and who are doing the work for change. So chances are you probably haven't heard of many of these folks or their stories, because they're not blowing their own horn. I always tell people, they're like, well, why are you? Because people who do good things, like, they aren't seeking the press. They aren't calling the Inquirer or the TV station and saying, hey, look at me. Why? Because they're busy doing the work. And so it's not that they don't want to be recognized, because as you said, they appreciate it when people take time to recognize them. But it's because they're busy doing the work. They're not talking about it to anyone other than those who are helping in the mission and who are going to be beneficial of it. So the Upstander Awards are a great thing, and even when we get an opportunity to highlight folks in the paper, because what it does is it lets other people out there know that there's work being done and that there are good people doing good things, because the bad stuff has no problem getting out there, right? And you can be fooled into thinking like, oh man, there are only bad people and bad things happening. But nothing could be farther from the truth. And so somehow or another, not the individuals themselves, but those of us who are in this space of communicating and getting the information out, have to be able to find ways, like whether it's the Upstander Awards or things of that nature, to be able to highlight, to elevate that stuff, so that people say it's not all bad.
It's not all bad, and also that person's just like me. They have the same character strength I do. Like, what's to stop me from saying, how do I activate my own sort of engine to bring about positive humanity? And so that's what we did. We want to highlight one. I wish we had more time, but we're just going to highlight one of the awards that we gave out on at the Upstander Awards. So it's named after a couple by the name of Mark and Margaret Marin, who had this incredible story of survival and had a young son right when the war broke out. And they had to make a very tough decision to put their son into hiding. And this child, baby, right, less than a year old, survived, I think, 3 different camps.
Wow.
And his parents just never gave up hope after the war that they would find him. And they looked and they looked and they looked. And then when they couldn't think they could look anymore, they looked and they found him. And he didn't even know his own name. He was 2 years old. And we were able to actually talk to Harry in Indiana, who's still their son, who's still with us. And he came back for the awards and presented this award. So I'm standing here on the stage looking at Harry coming up the ramp thinking, you are a miracle. The fact that you're here is nothing short of miraculous. When you think about what happened to 5 children who were 5 months old,
Yeah.
Jewish children in Europe who were 5 months old, who were caught in the camp system. It's nothing short of miraculous that he survived this. And then we were able to recognize this award for hope because his parents, that's what saved Harry's life in many ways. That's what brought him back to his family, is this undying hope that his parents had, that he would be found, that they could find him against all odds. So we gave the award, the Mark and Margaret Marin Award for Hope, to a friend of mine, not because he's a friend of mine, he happens to be a friend of mine, Mitch Morris, who is doing amazing work around empowering young people and addressing some challenges around gun violence, and walking with people through struggle in that way. It's just such an unsung hero in my eyes. And so it was special to have Harry there to present the award directly to Mitch. And just passing of that torch of character strength, like who's taken this strength and who's carrying that legacy today. Yeah. So we want to show you the little video we put together sharing that story, and then we come back and talk about it.
Mark Marin was born in Germany, Margaret Friedman Marin in the Netherlands. They married in Amsterdam in 1939 and had a son, Harry, just as the Nazi grip tightened across Europe. Forced into hiding in 1942, they made the painful decision to hide Harry separately. In 1944, he was captured, but survived Bergen-Belsen and Theresienstadt. Every day, Margaret searched for his name among survivor lists. One day, she saw Yadamin Israel and said, "That is our Harry." Against all odds, she was right. Hope brought them back together.
Today, Mitch Morris brings that same hope into Cincinnati's inner city communities.
I've seen a lot of pain in our city and our community, and I just feel that we need to be able to do something about it.
Through the Phoenix program, he helps adults leave street life behind. Through Save Our Youth, he mentors teens, creates jobs, and builds safer futures, offering structure, purpose, and pride. Mitch meets people where they are, in crisis, in conflict, and walks with them towards something better.
The parents who have lost family members to gun violence over the years, and how simple it is for somebody to make a bad decision to cause somebody's families in that ripple effect. And so I just feel I have to be able to try to do something to turn that thing around.
Because for Mitch Morris, hope is a daily practice, and it always shows up.
So, yeah, an incredible story, right? With the miracle of survival, the miracle of finding your child who, you had to separate from at 5 months old, and then recognizing that through Mitch's amazing work today, all through that sort of shared sense of hope. It was really special. It was one of many amazing stories and moments at the awards this year. So shout out to Mitch. And also it was great to sort of re-engage with Harry, who was there to help give the award this year. It was so special.
Yeah, it's, just, honing in on that theme of hope. I think the work that Mitch does is exactly that, just in terms of trying to bring hope and sort of recovery and healing for folks here in the city who suffer from gun violence and the trauma associated with that. And it's one of the bigger issues that we have going on in Cincinnati right now with the violence that we see and so many families being affected by it. You need more folks like Mitch who are out there, doing the hard work of helping people put their lives back together, after tragedy.
And if you've ever met Mitch, like you just get this overwhelming feeling like he is not in it for this is not about awards. This isn't about recognition or spotlight. It's really because he believes in what he's doing, and he cares a lot about our city. He cares a lot about the people he helps. And, it's just really inspiring to see him recognized in this way, and to hear from him. I mean, to hear what it means to him to be an Upstander. So before we close out for our first season, we want to end on our Upstander shout out. And we were thinking about, who we should recognize, and we wanted to put the spotlight on our friend Jesse Eisenberg, who came to basically be the celebrity host of this year's Upstander Awards. He threw out the first pitch at the Reds game. And he recently, the reason we asked him to join us this year is because of his most recent work in the space of Holocaust memory. He, wrote, directed, and actually starred in A Real Pain, which was the Oscar award-winning. Kieran Culkin won the award for supporting actor in that film about two cousins who are coming together in their own sort of dysfunction. It's actually really a funny movie. To retrace their late grandmother's sort of journey through World War II and through that time and through the Holocaust. And it's all of the things you can imagine, the awkward moments and the poignancy and the severity of the history, sort of as the backdrop to a very human story about two cousins trying to navigate their own pain. Yeah. It's really so beautiful. So he talked a lot about that. I got to interview him. That was pretty fun. Yes. And and then he's a really great guy. Just a normal dude,
Yeah. Well, a lot of times when we think about people who achieve that level of celebrity or fame that, we think they're so far removed from the rest of us. And it's always refreshing when you meet someone like Jesse who shows you that, just because you're in Hollywood, just because you've been on the big screen, that they're still as relatable as anybody else. And those are the types of folks, when you meet them like that you become fans of. Like, even if you may not have been a fan of him prior to that, I've found so many other people who I really like or have become fans of. It's because you see them in real life, or you see them in real situations, and they're actually like real human beings, not sort of like the pretentious, elite sort of Hollywood types as sometimes some are, or as they're portrayed. And so it's good to know that he's one of the down to earth.
It's actually interesting. We would give him a shout out on this episode, because we've talked a lot about intellectual humility, about curiosity. And Jesse really, I was with him for 48 hours, not obviously continuously, but, over the course of 2 days. And that shines through over and over again, and how he is with everyday people. Just, in his conversations, he's so curious. He's actually very hard to move through a crowd, because he's wants to really understand. And he's follow-up questions. And this is not just for, me or our board chair. This was everybody he met. He wanted to really learn more, and he was so curious. And curiosity, I think, is one of the keys to unlocking that intellectual humility, right? It's or maybe it's the other way around. I think they probably feed each other. So he's really an upstanding guy, and we hope he'll come back maybe next year to join us for the Upstander Awards as a guest. And appreciate him taking the time out of his very busy life. He's working on another film right now to join us. So thank you, Jesse.
You guys are doing a great job of landing some big names for this event to come in and lend their voices and their platforms to it.
Maybe our folks who are listening and watching can help source, who should we bring next year?
That's a good idea.
I'd love to hear people's suggestions. Who's using their character strengths to stand up for positive humanity, and justice and change, and who's thinking about the lessons of history in a way that can maybe help us wrestle with some things today. So Please let us know if you have any good ideas, and we will see you on the next season of the Upstander Ripple Effect podcast, coming soon to a car, iPad, computer, audio device near you. Right. Thanks for joining us. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or visit holocaustandhumanity.org/podcast. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. The Upstander Ripple Effect is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills, and technical director is Josh Emerson. The opening sequence is by Ken Furman. Select music is by Kick Lee, and this is recorded at Technical Consulting Partners Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.